Councilmember Shimoni.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to everybody who presented, and Seth, especially a big thank you to you and being with us today and sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it. A couple quick questions for you. You talked about VMT in relation to greenhouse gases. Can you talk about VMT in relation to idling time? We're having a lot of conversations about projects and idling time being an argument being made as to why we need a larger project or a more efficient level of service. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So, yeah, the vehicle miles traveled, when I gave that example at the beginning of how when you got in your car and you go to work and you drove 8 miles, you know, you did, for those 8 miles, you did stop at perhaps a couple of lights. There was some idling time. So there was some time there in terms of maybe it took you 20, 25 minutes, and factored into that 8 VMT when estimating the greenhouse gases of that 8 VMT. A lot of these models are very sophisticated where it takes into account the full cycle of that trip, including even just starting your car. That once you start that vehicle, you're giving off some emissions, then you hit the gas, you're doing some idling, and then accelerating. So it's taking into account that full cycle when estimating it. But you bring up a good point on idling at intersections. It comes down to when you're evaluating a project, what are your evaluation metrics? Is idling and queue lengths your top priority, which, yeah, for some areas and some communities can be, but as part of the long-range transportation plan, we're bringing in other important performance metrics that also speak to public health, equity, safety. And so it's not just considering idling and queue lengths, but, you know, based on even just the declaration of climate emergency that I saw took place there in Flagstaff, that's also a top priority. That bringing in VMT allows you to also consider that metric in addition to just idling. But you want to look at everything at the same time. There's going to be some trade-offs.
I appreciate that. And you know, I love that you brought up priorities and that public health, equity, and safety you mentioned. I fully agree with you. Just quick question, in your experience working with other municipalities, how do we as a council body help our team shift away into adopting different sets of priorities?
Yeah, that's a good question, because those numbers that I showed, the 30%, you know, I don't mean to say that overnight you're going to see that 30%, that this is a shift. It's going to take some time, but luckily you're not the first ones out of the box doing this, that there have been plenty of other even peer cities as close as Park City doing this and taking those. What I have found also to be very strategic in what cities have done is doing pilots rather than saying that we're going to do this new project, bring in, let's say, a new bike share system permanently, or repurpose a road and make it only one lane in each direction and make it a complete street. That instead they said, look, we're just going to pilot it for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Let people try it out. I think that tends to help ease some of that initial tension and uncertainty, which is completely understandable. But I have found that just initial step towards doing a pilot and only offering it as just short term to test it out, that hopefully maybe you'll fail quickly and learn from it, just like the Yellow Bike Share program, so that you could then come back and do it just more efficiently the next time around.
Okay, and then my last question for you, at least for now, is a point of somewhat of a contentious point internally with our team has been the thought about the idea that building more roads is not only more expensive but less effective at addressing congestion, with congestion being the underlying point of what we're trying to prioritize. Can you speak to, again, that idea that building more roads is not only more expensive but less effective at addressing congestion? Is that something that you subscribe to as well, or can you speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, this is one of those ongoing debates, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I subscribe to one or the other. I go based on just the empirical evidence and data and what we've observed. And, you know, the majority of the time you add that roadway lane, within 5 years, it fills back up. And then we're asked by the engineers or the city mayors, why did that happen? And it's because of induced demand. But yeah, this big shift in thinking, it's about not just thinking about that road lane, but thinking about the users of that system, and trying to manage the demand side, manage the users, and giving just them more options as well. I find too that we're also at a time during COVID where it was kind of almost like a national experiment where everyone stopped driving for a period of time. And for the first time also, we saw greenhouse gases did go down across the US in terms of from the transportation sector. But then VMT picked right back up as things started to open up. But that was proof there that by reducing our vehicle miles traveled, we do reduce greenhouse gases. And is that something you as a community prioritize more than, say, adding a few more seconds of delay to your travel time, or you know, adding more queue lengths to how you have to wait? That what are your priorities right now? And I just think greenhouse gases, it's more, that's thinking more long term in terms of just community values and you know, how you want your community to look like, not just today, tomorrow, but 20 years from now. And also, you know, we talk a lot about greenhouse gases, and that's in the long term, but there's something to be said. I never even touched on emissions and air quality and air pollution. And those you get immediate short-term, near-term benefits quickly on the air pollution and public health side. The greenhouse gases is more about the climate, but the emissions from those road vehicles, there's something to be said about the air pollution impacts.
Thank you, Seth. And Mary, my last question for you, for Seth at this point is just, you know, you said that Flagstaff has a minimal biking infrastructure, and you spoke about the heroes, but yet the dangers that exist for the conditions that we have. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this, because when I look at Flagstaff, I think of a mountain town with a very active community, a lot of athletes, a lot of people wanting to be active. I think that we have such an opportunity to lead the nation as an example, but others that I speak to don't agree with me. I'm just curious at times, what your thoughts are when you look at Flagstaff and our community and our size and how we're landlocked. If we didn't have just a minimal biking infrastructure, but a holistic network that was completed, what are your thoughts about our potential?
Well, yeah, you mentioned their potential, that the behavior and demand management side, that you already have a really good hiking trail network that has been there for quite a long time. That I was really impressed by that in my visit last May. But yeah, I mean, I have many thoughts. I want to stay objective in my presentation and just present facts and you know, help to just try to bridge that gap in understanding and in VMT. But you're right. I do believe that there is a lot of potential when you're already having a community that is very active, that lives active lifestyles, that opens up doorways to more potential for those more active transportation modes.
Thank you.
And I'm really energized by it. So thanks.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilmember Shimoni.
Thank you, Mayor. Couple questions and comments. So I want to just by restating Metro Plan's vision, which I just love, to create the finest transportation system in the country. That's ambitious, and that's the type of what's the word I use with you, Dr. Contreras? Possibilities or potential. That's the type of potential I'm looking for us to adopt, council, and us to lead. Like a lot of folks have already said, a lot of these things are within our wheelhouse as policymakers to address directly. You know, whether it's parking minimums or design values, that's decisions we can make, and we have the opportunity and the privilege to make. And I only hope that, you know, when we come to those decision-making points, we have the political will to see that through. So my questions, I'm going to start with Jeff at the city. Jeff, if Bauman, if you can help me with these questions. So we just heard a lot of really good information, and I feel really energized by this conversation too. But I'm wondering, how do we transition into a more transformative approach in dealing with congestion and our road designs and our values? Because ultimately it's quite frankly, our traffic engineers, our engineers, and our leadership, along with us policymakers. But Jeff, you have a lot of responsibility in this, and I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on how do we get from A to B.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of my second slide, or my third slide, I suppose, was we need to get these frameworks developed and recommendations flowing out of the mini grant coming out of Metro Plan and the Regional Transportation Plan update to give us the strategies to implement through those codes and policies that I tried to overview and outline in my earlier slide. So I don't know what the right move is at this point, but I know we're moving in that direction to figure out what that next move is.
Great. And, other than that mini grant, which I think is great, but, where do we start? It's like, how long will it take? Are we talking about a year? And what do we do in the interim? Because we're already obviously planning projects that are massive, that, like as Councilmember Aslam said, are going to last forever. What do we do in the interim, and how long do you think this shift is going to take?
I think that's an unfair question for me. How long is this shift going to take? I have no idea. I mean, things like land use we just talked about could be 10, 20, 30 years before we see really significant changes throughout the community. Maybe that's too long, but I'm going to need help. Yeah, I've seen Nicole put her hand up and Dave Wessel put his hand up. Transportation planner will help a lot in this discussion. Thank you for putting your hands up.
Mayor, if that's okay with you, can we go to what? David, then to Nicole?
Yep, either one, welcome to jump in on that front.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Shimoni. So you've heard talk about the mini grant, and really one of the first things the mini grant would set out to do, this first phase, is looking at kind of system performance measures. Things we've done really well, I think, in the past of having all these great policies, and you saw Nicole present a number of those. And then we've done a fairly good job of having some development standards. How wide should you build your sidewalk? But we have big gaps in the middle ground. How many connections should you have? How dense should your road network be? We really don't have any of those things in place. And so phase one is really looking at those kind of performance metrics. And then phase two would be all of those development standards that we need, putting them into contextual, urban, suburban that we need, and including subdivision standards, which would get to that connectivity expectations within any given subdivision. And so you've got, in terms of how much time to get to some of those things, how long does it take to draft the new regulations? How long does it take to go through the adoption process? So that's the process to really put those systems in place that allow us to enact many of the things that you heard about tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. Nicole?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, Nicole Antonopoulos, Sustainability Director. If I may offer to the Council, perhaps that staff and the team that's really worked to put this presentation together can get together to create a realistic time frame and a needs assessment. So exactly, essentially doing a SWOT analysis and then providing that information to Council. And I would like to at least offer that sustainability will make this a priority, and I hope that our internal and external partners have time to squeeze us in, but perhaps we could provide that for the Council just to get a better understanding, because this is a lot. And there, as you've heard throughout the presentation, there are so many layers to this and cascading impacts of policy decisions not only from a capital improvement component, but from community development and development agreement. And there's just a lot that is going to have to be looked at and assessed and addressed. So if I may offer that, and with your direction, I think that could be very helpful, not only for the council and for city staff, but also for the community.
So Nicole, really quick.
Yeah, I really appreciate the suggestion, Nicole.
Specifically, thank you. Nicole, can you specifically say one more time what that direction would need to, what would that sound like from council?
I'm sorry, Councilmember Simone, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, I was asking specifically, can you just state again what the specific direction would need to be to get us to what you're talking about?
Well, so we need to do some internal, we need to have some internal assessment and do essentially a SWOT analysis to ensure that we understand where we have gaps and needs. And of course, the Metro Plan mini grant is a huge step, as you've heard, in moving in that direction. But I think we do need some time to pull together essentially a path forward and putting benchmarks and that will be associated with making this big shift. Does that make sense? I hope I explained that well.
It does, thank you. And I just have a couple more comments. And I'll just state really quick, I fully support that direction, Mayor and Council, and I hope that there's a majority that will support that so staff can start working on that. I was hoping that we would be able to potentially have a conversation tonight about our values, Council, and making that switch of putting, pedestrians at the top, cyclists at the, the secondary, public transit, then, et cetera, and then the personal vehicle last. I'm guessing that, Mayor, we're not going to have that conversation tonight or be able to make that policy decision tonight. I did ask for a fare on this conversation, so I'm hoping that comes back to us sooner than later. And I guess that comment's for Rick Barrett and our team, because I think this council's ready to make that decision and help our engineers with that policy direction. But I'd like to think that our staff is seeing the writing on the wall that this is coming, and that we need to start thinking about this more and more. Dr. Contreras, I just have a couple last questions for you. What would be your words of wisdom to this council when we consider reducing lanes on the project, and staff tells us that the modeling shows that this will result in backups? What wisdom can you give us to help overcome that comment?
Yeah, and that's a very common comment that I have heard. So that's nothing new. But my reaction there is, number one, the model. When we say the model, I mentioned in my presentation, it's a decision support tool. It's not a decision tool. That I think over the years, too much decision making is placed on the model itself versus it just being seen as to provide support for those decisions. And second, the model, it's looking strictly at, you mentioned traffic. So the model, what I want to know too is in terms of the outputs of that model, is it telling us traffic in terms of level of service and average delay for the drivers only? Can the model tell me anything else? Can it also tell me what the vehicle miles traveled are for one scenario versus the other? Can it tell me what other performance metrics like safety, accessibility, that if we're only just looking at traffic from the driver's perspective, is that the approach the council or the decision on a project is that the approach that they want to take, only looking at traffic through the lens of the driver?
And Dr. Contreras, a lot of times we'll hear about peak hour and peak hour modeling. Can you just speak to that approach and that viewpoint or perspective of looking at modeling during peak hour versus, maybe a full day?
Yeah, so peak hour, when it comes to planning and forecasting and making investments in large-scale transportation projects, the business as usual approach is to always plan for the worst case scenario, that you want to plan for the peak hour, average daily peak hour commute time to build that infrastructure for that peak hour, which in some very congested areas could even be a peak period, maybe a couple hours, maybe 4 p.m. to 7 p.m., and then maybe 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. So there's 6 hours out of a full day that investment is being decided on, but it's still a very important time in terms of people getting to and from where they need to go, work, school, doctor's appointment. But yeah, the peak period, the peak hour, that has always been used as sort of the worst case scenario to evaluate.
Then, Mayor, my last question is also for you, Dr. Contreras. Can you just speak to parking demands in our codes, whether it's for businesses being built or apartment complexes or just development in general? We have a lot of parking demands that are basically incentivizing or creating a false sense of free parking when there is really a cost. Can you just speak to that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked really closely at the parking code or minimum requirements for new development in the city of Flagstaff, but there are cities that are rethinking those requirements, especially in light of ongoing trends. So, for example, a lot of parking codes were defined at a time even before, let's say, Uber and Lyft, for example. So a new restaurant, a new hotel, a new office, that assumed it was based on trip generation rates that maybe predated these other shared mobility options, or even at a time when there wasn't more multimodal options available. But you're getting down now to like the root of some of the land use planning, that if you really go back and look down at the cause, that for these land use decisions, when you're building new housing development or new office or new restaurant, that requiring those developers to meet those parking requirements, that can really shape and dictate just how much automobile travel that's going to generate. And even times it could be overparked, for example, where it's overestimating the parking demand. And so all of that surface space, and there's really something to be said too about parking in terms of what they call the urban heat island effect, that when you have all of that amount of space, asphalt, hard surface put towards parking, and especially if it's underutilized, when it could be used for other purposes, that urban heat island effect is also a phenomenon where they have measured before and after temperatures on just maybe big giant parking lots that were designed for day after Thanksgiving sales and Black Friday, where maybe more now people are doing the Cyber Mondays, for example. But factor in that urban heat island effect is important as well in the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone who's been presenting tonight. And Mayor, thank you. Appreciate it.